Three, two, one. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of the Conscious Lover series. My name is Miko Lau, and I am a men's coach devoted to guiding men back to their hearts so they can experience heart centered intimacy, liberated sex, and extraordinary love. And joining me today is Martin Mezei. Martin is a men's coach consultant and men's work facilitator who is on a mission to help men explore their authentic, healthy masculinity, working towards a world where it's a given for men to do inner work. Martin is currently helping men's coaches create thriving coaching practices that transform the lives of men and those around them. And he does this through coaching leaders, speaking, and writing about everything related to manhood. So, on today's conversation, we're going to be diving deep into some of the topics such as how to embody healthy masculinity, healing for better relationships, and conscious communication tools designed for men. So, with that being said, Martin, I am so excited and so honored that you'll be joining us today. Thank you for being on this series.
Hi, Miko, and greetings to everyone listening. Thank you so much for the kind introduction. And yeah, absolutely. It's my pleasure to be here.
Beautiful. So, Martin, let's jump right into this conversation. I am curious as you're sitting here joining us, being in this space. I'm curious what's coming up for you as we talk about conscious lovership. What does that mean to
hmm
you?
hmm Yeah. Well, I would say that the word conscious gets thrown around a lot these days, and I'm sure it has different meanings to many different people out there. For me personally, the word conscious represents wisdom that goes beyond the rational mind, that goes beyond our mental intellect, and that taps into a deeper wisdom that we either hold in our body, so that can be through body awareness, or it can be in an even more spiritual sense, being tapped into the oneness of everything. That's what conscious represents or means for me. I mean, when it comes to being a lover, being a partner in life, being one of the poles in a relationship, I feel like consciousness is very relevant because it is very easy, in my experience, in getting lost in the rational and mental mazes, things that the mind creates that are not necessarily real or don't need to be real, and rather tapping into our consciousness when we are being a lover or partner, I think is very empowering. And honestly, I think it's one of the ultimate life experiences that we all seek as human beings.
Yeah, absolutely. I absolutely love what you just described for us. And I oftentimes forget how much I love talking about this kind of things because I
Mm,
feel like it is so needed. You know, we live in a society that highly celebrates the intellect, the logical mind, the analytical mind. But
yeah.
coming back into our body and connecting from the depths of our body awareness is a totally different experience.
hmm
So I'm really curious for you, Martin, like how did you even get into this work? How did you
hmm
get to this part of your journey today?
hmm hmm Yeah, I'm more than happy to share that. Before I do, however, I would love to share a little metaphor I love to use when it comes to differentiating between the rational mind and consciousness. Because
Mm-hmm.
I think for those that are, maybe earlier on this journey, or maybe they've already been on this journey for a while, but they just have a little bit of trouble differentiating between the two. I always say that the rational mind is the smartphone of consciousness, right? So having a smartphone is amazing, right? Having this screen, this little supercomputer in your pocket is great. You can look at maps, you can Google things real quick, you can find information that helps you be more productive, right? So it's a tool, it's amazing, it's powerful. And yet at the same time, if you get addicted to it, and all you do is stare at this screen, and it's starting to block out the rest of your life, that's unhealthy, and it's not empowering anymore. It takes away from your life experience. So I think it works the same between consciousness and your intellect, right? So it's really important that we make the distinguishment. I don't think the rational mind or intellect is bad in any way. It's just that it's a tool like any other that needs to be used properly. And to
Yeah.
answer your question, how did I get into this work? How did I get like the insight that I'm sharing right now and get into the position that I am in today, humbled enough to be in today? It really all started with relationships in my life being very unhealthy and toxic, really. So I saw the other side of what a conscious relationship or being a conscious lover could be by being an extremely unconscious lover. So I come from a what one might call a broken family, right? So my parents divorced very early on. I think I was 4 years old. And so I never really had the example of a healthy relationship in front of me until a long time later in my life. And I noticed when I was in high school already, when I would just started exploring things like relationships or sexuality, my relationships were immediately very unhealthy, and you could even say toxic. The patterns were the very common: seeking my partner's validation, feeling lots of extreme jealousy, or my partner feeling extreme jealousy and me not being able to address that. So interesting to observe that started as young as being 16, 17, like my first relationship in high school as a teenager. And those patterns did not go away. So the insecurity that I had felt throughout my childhood, perhaps because of not coming from a stable home, and that was kept alive by these young relationships, continued into my adult life, into my young adult life. And I would say that it really came to its pinnacle when I had my first very serious relationship, in which the girl I was dating, I was together with, I was planning a life together with. So I actually wanted her to be my wife, to be the mother of my children, and so on. And this relationship ended with my partner, my ex-partner, cheating on me. And that was probably one of the most difficult experiences of my life, going through that. And that's something that really pushed me to learn more about how relationships work. I started asking the questions: why did I choose to be with someone that would cheat on me? Of course, first I blamed external factors, right? So it was her fault, and it was the other guy's fault, and it was society's fault, and so on and so forth. But eventually, I realized that it's actually me. It was actually me who chose to be in this relationship. It was actually me who did not manage the relationship correctly, right? I decided to take ownership, to take responsibility. And that's what made me dive into a little bit of research about relationships in a more conscious way.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing that. I was totally relating to pretty much everything that you said. Almost all of the breakthroughs in my own personal journey and consciousness and ways of relating always come from the most difficult and heartbreaking moments in my own relationships as well. And I always
Mm,
look at those as an opening or an invitation for us to dive deeper and get to know ourselves on a more deeper level beyond the surface. And yeah, that turning point as well is when we can recognize that it's all a reflection of who we are, and we are always evoking certain behaviors or qualities from the individuals that are in our lives. Like when we can recognize that and take that ownership, everything changes. It is so empowering and it becomes really fun. So
yeah.
thank you for sharing that. Let's talk about what it means to embody healthy masculinity. I feel like this is a
Hmm.
conversation that gets to have more often. And that gets to be more clarity around what it even means, what masculinity even looks like or feel like. So if you could share more into that.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, in our modern men's work movement, so for those of you, those that are not familiar, there's an actual movement of helping men connect to themselves, to each other, to their partners, to their environment. And this men's work movement is not really political in any way, so it doesn't promote one certain kind of masculinity. Rather than doing that, it simply encourages individuals to find their own definition that empowers them, that brings them the most fulfillment and happiness and alignment in their lives. But there are certain guidelines in this genre of men's work, if you will, which are mostly based on Jungian psychology, because Carl Jung, the psychologist, had a fantastic theory on archetypes. The four archetypes of masculinity are the king, warrior, magician, and lover. And these four archetypes are present in our mythology, present in our religions. And if you look around, they are to this day present in our movies and our entertainment industry and in the way that we view ourselves. Jung's theory was that all of these archetypes have a whole or empowered side that is taking action or has a way of being that benefits all, that is for the greater good and is inspired by love. But then each archetype also has a side which is inspired by fear and is more pursuing selfish goals. And so each of these archetypes, the king has a shadow that is called a tyrant. There are multiple shadows, but let's just focus on one. It has a shadow called the tyrant. So one can be a just ruler, right? And I'm sure that each of us have examples that come to mind when we think of a just ruler, a good king. But a king can also be a tyrant. A warrior can fight for a good cause, right? And there are parts in our life, chapters in life, when we all have to be a warrior in a certain sense. But we also know that a warrior can turn into a bully. And the same way a magician can turn into a manipulator and a lover can turn into an addict. And so when it comes to masculinity, healthy masculinity is different for all of us. But I think in summary, we can say that when we really simplify what we see in mythology, when we really simplify what we see, what we share in our human psyche through a multicultural lens, is that masculinity is the energy which initiates, penetrates, and leads. And what that means is that masculinity is, when masculine energy is the one that starts, right? And that's very common in our culture, that the man initiates. A good leader who has that masculine energy initiates. And by penetrating, of course, one can take it in a sexual sense, and there's certainly an overarching pattern in that. But it's more that the masculine is expected to break through obstacles, right? That's what the warrior does. And lastly, leadership is something that's been associated with manhood for a very long time. And it doesn't necessarily need to be political or even leadership from a power sense or power point of view, but rather leadership of oneself, leadership of one's family, leadership in one's community.
I love that you brought in those four archetypes into this conversation, because it's very much something that we can visualize and we can apply in our everyday life. And I also want to just drop in something really quickly, and I feel like this is something that I get to remind myself often as well, speaking as a woman that at the core very much feminine identify.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
But at the same time, everything that you just mentioned, I also resonate a lot, because masculine and feminine energy is within every being, doesn't matter what gender we are. So it is just,
Yes.
it's a reminder to myself that, yeah, I can see how the shadow sides of the masculinity can oftentimes come through if we
Mm-hmm.
are not fully conscious of choosing the love-based masculinity. So thank you for sharing that.
Mm-hmm.
So Martin, let's say someone listening right now, tuning in, they're not so much, I wouldn't say totally new to this conversation, but they are wanting to go in deeper, wanting to embody this healthy masculinity. Where would you say they start, or where would they go to deepen into this work?
Mm-hmm. Well, if I can make any recommendations, where the journey started for me was the fantastic book by David Deida, who is a powerful teacher across many disciplines, but he has a book called Way of the Superior Man.
Mhm.
And this book is an excellent resource, and I think a really good starting point. Um, the book where these four archetypes that we just mentioned, King, Warrior, Magician, Lover, by Douglas Gillette and Robert L. Moore, is also a great resource to start with.
Beautiful. Thank you for sharing that. You know, I hear the book by David Data recommended so many times by other
Mm-hmm.
speakers as well in the series. So definitely, if you feel
Nice.
called to, yeah, to the audience, if you're resonating with that, definitely get your hands on one of those if you haven't already. Um,
Yes.
so, Martin, let's talk about how embodying this healthy masculinity translates into relationships.
Mm-hmm.
What does that look like when a man is fully, stepping
Mm-hmm.
in, doing this work around his masculinity?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, Nico, I think when one taps into their healthy masculinity, exactly as we talked about, they start raising their awareness. I really like how you said that, but being conscious is kind of making the choice to act a certain way, right? So you become more aware, more intentional, and less compulsive. You
Mhm.
choose to act in a certain way rather than react to something. There's a pause between the stimulus and then the action that you take to respond to that. And that's exactly what it's like to be a man, to be a lover, having done a fair amount of man's work, a fair amount of work around one's masculinity. Though the work is always ongoing, you know, it never really ends. It's always a work in progress. But at the same time, what happens is that men can find some rest from overthinking and worrying.
Mm.
I've seen it become extremely common these days that men, even when they are in a relationship, they still worry about themselves being good enough to be in that relationship, being good enough for their partners. And that can cause insecurity. It can cause neediness. It can cause jealousy, right? It can really shake the foundation of building a life together with your partner.
Mhm.
However, when you take a more conscious approach, what ends up happening is that you're able to distinguish what is noise that's just happening on the mental level and what is actual truth. And when you identify that noise happening on the mental level, you can also lead it back to, oh, well, now I see this is actually coming from childhood trauma, or this is actually coming from the social conditioning that I've been fed about how I'm supposed to be as a man, or how I'm supposed to show up in a relationship, and so on and so forth. So I'll say that the result ultimately is that you're able to be more present for your partner. Small things don't necessarily cause fights anymore. Small things don't necessarily trigger insecurities anymore. If they do, those emotions can be truly felt and then processed and let go of. And a more stable, more fulfilling, and happier relationship, and therefore life can be built because with that presence, with that emotional security and certainty, you can show up to play more, to have more
Mm.
fun, to provide more safety for your partner, to hold them, to listen to them, to challenge them, to comfort them, and to build with them. And so, yeah.
Yeah, that's a really beautiful way of putting it. And one of the key words that popped up for me as you share that was the word rest. I feel like that idea of resting and like just
Hmm.
exhaling and breathing out and relaxing, it's so potent that it's
Mm,
almost like the foundation, the environment that's conducive for a loving relationship that nurtures each
yes.
other in the
Hmm.
partnership. And when we are not constantly in this fight flight or freeze mode trying to seek out things that might trigger us or might create feelings of rejection or abandonment, this deep rest inside this connection with another person is so deeply nurturing and can
Yes.
really feed each other in a very beautiful way. So, what are some ways that you recommend for men, in the work that you do with men's coaches and even just men in general with
Hmm.
communication? Like, how I feel like, in our society, most men have been taught not to embrace their emotions or to
Hmm.
embrace that vulnerability, that
Yeah.
sensitivity. So, what are some ways that they can communicate in a conscious way?
Yeah. That's a fantastic question. So, and actually, my first answer, I'm going to give you guys a few bullet points, but my first answer actually leads back to what you just said, which is rest. That's such an important part of a relationship. We come to our partner to find rest, right? To
Mhm.
recharge. Um, and I think for rest, we really need to feel safe, right? Unless we feel a certain sense of safety, there will be no rest. And so a conscious man's job is to be able to um, to establish that safe space and be a leader who's able to say, I'm going to be listening to you with no judgment, right? If you say something that offends me or hurts me, I will not lash out at you, you know? Um, and if something comes up for you where you might be judging yourself or hurting yourself, then I will calm you down and I'll give you the love and the affirmation that you need, right? And so that would be the first step, to be the man who's able to hold a safe space. Secondly, I think it's very important to be able to speak honestly and with vulnerability. So to not hold back emotions, to not um, let yourself be overcome by shame. Shame is a very natural emotion to feel, and probably one that comes up the most often when we are in relationships or in connections where we have these conversations to begin with. But it's very important that as a man, we overcome that shame, we recognize it as a fleeting emotion and not let it define our lives. So to be able to speak honestly and vulnerably is extremely important. And then to give it a third step, in men's work, it's very common. It's probably one of the most common advices that when we share about such sensitive topics, we only talk in first person. And this is to avoid projecting, right? So I'm not going to say, oh, I hate when you do this because every time I say this, you end up doing that, right? Because in that sentence, I'm already saying you. So I'm
Right.
projecting my perception and already trying to paint a picture with my perceptions. But rather than doing that, one can communicate only from the first person saying, I feel this. When you do that thing, I'm not sure exactly why you do it, but it makes me feel this way. And the story that comes up for me, the way I try to rationalize why you do it, is this,
Mm.
right? That all comes from me, because that's the only thing that you're truly able to speak about. And then if you want to ask, hey, is that because of X, Y, and Z? You can ask. But basically speaking only in first person removes a lot of the projection, removes a lot of assumption, and just allows for communication where you speak about the parts that you have most familiarity and most awareness of, which is yourself. So those would be the three biggest starting steps, I would say.
I absolutely love the last step, because even this simple practical tool along speaking with that first person language is, it's a way for individuals to embody full ownership and responsibility of everything that happens in his life. And I can speak that from a woman's perspective. Like, when a man does that, that's very attractive. When he can be
Hmm.
fully in ownership and in responsibility of what he creates, and owning that, that's very hot. So I just
Mm-hmm.
wanted to point that out. So Martin, as we are coming to an end of our conversation, I would love to hear from you. Just kind of
Mm-hmm.
tie this all into a bigger picture idea, seeing how
Yes.
when a man does this work, how does that
Mm-hmm.
translate into the bigger
Mm-hmm.
community, the the planet as a whole? What do you see that
Yeah,
transforms into?
absolutely. Such a great question. Thank you. Well, the biggest context that I can put all of this work in, and even its effects, can be summarized by one word, which is uh, a big cornerstone to my work, to my men's work facilitator craft, and also to my coaching and consulting craft, and it's practice, right? Practice. That's what all of this is at the end of the day. A lot of the mental noise, a lot of the overthinking, a lot of the emotional roller coasters come from the fact that we have expectations and attachments. We have expectations for ourselves, and when we don't reach those as men or women, we get mad, judgmental, and ashamed of ourselves, right?
Mhm.
And the same thing happens in our relationships. We may have expectations that we communicate. We may have expectations that we communicate without truly feeling into where our partner is at. We may have attachments to outcome of how we want the relationship to go, to feel, to be looked at from the outside. And when those don't come true, again, we are exposed to the emotional roller coaster, which has nothing to do with reality, because at the end of the day, the place where it came from was our own mental sand castle, our own mental, um, maybe better house of cards or maze that we built, and we got lost in ourselves. All of this changes when we start looking at life as practice. So connecting with a new person is an opportunity to practice, to be our most conscious, self-aware, and loving versions. Just speaking to our current partner, if you are in a committed relationship like I am, is the same. Just that one conversation is another opportunity to practice this. If your practice ends up being, well, not working out on that one occasion, you get upset or you get emotionally triggered and you're not really able to tap into your most conscious self, it's okay, as long as you're striving to do your best on each occasion, and then you reevaluate and you learn from each occasion that practice is ongoing and it will get better with time, as long as you give it time and as long as you stay patient with yourself. And lastly, this word of practice is so important because none of it is possible without a practice on the personal level, on the individual level. It will be so hard to be a conscious man in a happy, conscious relationship, enjoying your life to the fullest, if you don't have a daily practice that empowers you. That daily practice can look different for everyone. It may be walking, it may be reading, it may be listening to an audiobook, it may be meditating, it may be moving, or it may be all of those things above. But you do need a daily discipline that you put yourself through, as a check-in with yourself, to see where you're at, to see where your self-awareness is at, to see where your self-love is at. Without doing that check-in with yourself and holding that safe space with yourself, is going to be very difficult, if not impossible, to do that with another person, to do that with your partner. And if we all had a self-love and self-awareness daily practice like this. And if we all just let go of our expectations and our attachments to outcome and focus on the present, emphasize the loving practice of being a human being, then my hope is that our world would have a lot less violence. Our world would have a lot better mental health. We would have less greed and a lot more charitable intent in our humanity. We would have a lot less oppressive hierarchy, and rather we would have a lot more decentralized um, co-creation in our society, because all the things that I mentioned just now, the greed, the fear, the violence, all come from that place, all come from the place of the shadow of these masculine archetypes, all come from the
Mhm.
place of feeling like we're not good enough, or fear of whatever it may be. And I just hope that through a practice like this on the individual and collective level, we can move more towards love and cooperation.
Mm, wow. Thank you so much for highlighting the word practice, because even as I listen in, that again brings us back to the present moment. It is a moment by moment practice versus this big goal that we are trying to get to, that it's somewhere in the future, coming from a place of lack and need. But this
Yes.
reminder of practice in the now is
Hmm.
so powerful. So thank you for that. And thank you for this amazing conversation. I feel like I have become a totally different person just by being in your transmission, tuning
Thank
into
you.
your insights. And I hope our listeners are also finding the same powerful value from this today. So if they would like to stay connected with you, Martin, where can they find you?
Hmm. Yeah, thank you so much for the acknowledgement, Miko. It would
Mhm.
have not been possible without the very well articulated and planned questions. So thank you. And people can find me on Instagram is a platform where I am the most active. So my Instagram handle is the Martin Mezei, Mezei. It's the last name. So at the Martin Mezei on Instagram is where I do most of my content related to topics like this. And they can also find me on my website, which is mindfulmasculinity.org as an organization. Mindfulmasculinity.org is the website where you can find out more about my coaching and consulting work, um, and whatever else you're curious about.
Thank you so much for sharing. And I would love to encourage and empower everyone tuning in right now to take away one thing that really resonated with you and maybe share that with another person in your life, and just share this episode. I'll share this series with anyone that you know can absolutely find value in this. So
Mm,
until next time, I cannot wait to meet with y'all again. And thank you so much again, Martin, for joining us.
thank you, Miko, and thank you to everyone who was listening.
We'll see you all again next time. Take care.